All right, hey, Third Strike Radio fans, we are back with another episode of Behind the Mask. Haven't been on with you guys for a while, so certainly excited for this one, and actually very excited for this interview for many reasons, personally and professionally. So we're going to get right into it. We've got a really extensive bio that I want, actually a couple of bios that I just think are super worthy of reading about our next guest here. Soledad Haren is our guest today, and I'm going to get right into it and talk about some really cool stuff about her, and then we're going to welcome her in and get right into the interview. So she currently produces Green Living, Green Times, Green and Woke, Epoca Verde, Third Strike Rock, Third Strike en Español, and Third Strike Jazz and Funk. She's been a contributor to Huffington Post and The Young Turks, and she worked on a documentary for Vice TV. She's published one book with Chef Matthias Mueller, Orgasmic Burger. She was the editor and lead photographer. So that in itself could be enough to just stop right there, but no, we're going to go quite a bit further because I wanted to read this bio on the HuffPost.com is the website. And it introduces her as a freelance journalist and photographer, producer of the Green Living Show, and founder of Build a Better Planet. Soledad Haren was born near Cincinnati, Ohio, and spent much of her childhood in Houston, Texas. She spent time living throughout Europe, South America, and Mexico. During college, she worked for a Houston-based corporate law firm. Upon finishing graduate school, she relocated to New York City to study law. In New York, Soledad worked in the finance industry for several Wall Street securities firms. Then she returned to the legal field, working for a corporate law firm in many practice areas. In 2004, Soledad left the legal field entirely to work as a chef in Manhattan and Brooklyn. In the wake of 9/11, she developed a passion for all things green. Initially, her focus on holistic medicine and natural foods was to counter the effects of the toxins to which so many New Yorkers were exposed after the fall of the World Trade Center towers. However, this passion for natural living became an all-encompassing mission to be shared with others. Soledad founded Build a Better Planet, a nonprofit organization promoting sustainability to tell others about the benefits of natural living. In 2011, she began producing the Green Living radio show. The following year, she launched the Epoca Verde radio show, Green Living's Spanish language counterpart. In 2014, Build a Better Planet took over management of Third Strike Radio, a progressive online radio station, and launched 3 all-music radio channels, Third Strike Rock, Third Strike Jazz and Funk, and Third Strike en Español, to promote independent music. Soledad Haren is a freelance journalist and photographer. Soledad holds a BBA and an MBA from the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, and she currently lives in New York City. Wow, that is definitely one of the most extensive bios I've read on any interview I've done, but I just, when she sent these to me, I'm like, oh, we can't cut any of this out. This is all great material, and this is the way I want to start the show. So, without further ado, Soledad, welcome to the show. Welcome to Behind the Mask.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And I am so grateful that you've allowed the platform of Third Strike Radio to be able to do this program. So thank you for that.
Well, and I should add, you do this show and actually our Third Strike Rock show, which you mentioned.
That's correct. And I remember, just to give you guys a little backstory on how we met, which we actually talked about this briefly on the previous Behind the Mask show when Soledad interviewed me. And I remember how we connected. Back when I was still actually searching on Craigslist for opportunities, there was an ad that she had for bands and musicians of all kinds to interview them on Third Strike Radio. And I responded because, as most of you guys know, if you listen to any of our other Third Strike Radio programs, I am a fellow musician as well. So I responded, and Soledad interviewed my band Communique on her program. And that was, remind me what show that was again. That was Green Living, right?
Green Living, that's right.
That's correct. So we connected at that time, and we've never looked back. So again, it's such a pleasure to have you on. So I want to just kind of go back to, it says that in your bio, it says that you were born near Cincinnati, Ohio?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
The burbs.
The burbs, okay. So how long did you live in that area until you moved?
We moved, I would have been about 3 or 4 when we moved to Houston. That was part of the whole Rust Belt. And as a rock musician yourself, you know, that whole Rust Belt era inspired many a depressing song. My hometown, like Bruce Springsteen and Allentown, by Billy Joel. I think everybody, there were so many people who moved down south at that time, particularly to Texas. There was kind of and they were all from the Rust Belt, Ohio, Pennsylvania. My best friends whom I grew up with, they were from actually Allentown, Pennsylvania. And in Michigan, that was another big one. And there was kind of an ongoing joke, hey, will the last person from Michigan turn out the lights? Just there was such an exodus of folks who left left the Midwest to go down south. And for our younger audience, for our younger listeners, what was going on at the time was the Opec Crisis. And it's really interesting how some of these themes keep coming back again and again and again. So everything in that part of the country at the time was steel related, linked to the automobile industry. And at that time, they were making, in the 70s, they made these gigantic boat-sized cars. the Ford, the LTDs, the Crown Victorias and stuff, and the Buicks. Remember the Oldsmobiles, these gigantic cars that were, of course, incredible. They were gas guzzlers, very, very heavy. And the OPEC crisis hit, and I have very distinct memories of that because, like I said, we moved to Texas in a Chevy Nova.
Oh, wow.
Ironically, that's Spanish for doesn't go, so I thought that was kind of funny. But we did not have air conditioning, as many cars did not have air conditioning at the time. And we had these vinyl seats. And, of course, oil was rationed. Gasoline was rationed. You had to fill up on certain days, depending on your license plate. And I just remember sitting in that Texas sun in this heavy metal car with the vinyl seats so that you're getting swamp butt as you're just sitting there in a pool of your own sweat, just like literally baking in these crazy lines waiting to fill up. And, of course, ironically, that's when the Japanese then came out with all these small cars like Datsun, which I believe is now Nissan. And, we just really, it seems to be that, we're always $1, was it a day late and $1 short in terms of addressing what the public actually needed and wanted from the car industry. Because, we would then see that years later when in the 90s, again, we started making these Hummer-type vehicles, and I never quite understood the appeal of the Hummer because I'm like, this car gets 8 miles to the gallon. Where are you driving? And why do you need that type of a vehicle if you're living in the city somewhere? Like, I've seen a few even in New York City where I live now, and I'm like, where are you going off-roading? Central Park? Like, where are you driving this thing? And always in the school bus yellow, right? Look at me, look at me.
That's true.
And so started making those cars. Japan responded by starting to make electric cars. It was actually, it didn't occur to me until recently that they started making, what was the first, the Prius, I guess, was one of the first ones sold in this country. That was back in the 90s. So I'm like, we're always, now you're starting to see more more U.S. U.S. made electric cars. But yeah, we're kind of behind the game on that one. But anyway, long story short, when Detroit hit hard times, all of the steel companies that supplied Detroit with steel also had hard times, and so my hometown, as Bruce Springsteen would say, did fall on hard times, and so we ended up moving to Texas.
So when your family moved you guys to Texas, which, by the way, you have brothers and sisters, right, as well?
Yes, there are 4 of us all together.
Oh, wow. So when your parents moved you guys to Texas, was one of your parents scheduled to basically transfer to a job in Texas, or was it just kind of, let's just go and see what we can make of it?
No, my dad moved down first.
Okay.
And, then found work, and then my mom and I, the mom and the kids. Well, actually, no, my brother was not even around, so my mom and I, and we came later. Yeah, and then, ironically, both of my folks ended up working in the oil industry.
Oh, wow.
So there's, that's kind of a little bit of irony there. But that was the main thing in Texas at the time. As a matter of fact, I remember as a little kid watching Dallas and this
Sure.
whole oil family dynasty, which is so funny because I've traveled to a lot of different places around the world since then, and everywhere I go, people are still asking me who shot JR.
Oh, no. Are you serious? Oh, my gosh. So in your bio, it says that you have spent time living in Europe, South America, and Mexico?
Yes, that's correct. Well, because my folks worked in the oil industry, it was almost like being raised as an army brat, but it was, instead of an army brat, you're a corporate brat. And my father got transferred quite a bit because of his job, and so that's what took us to some of these places. And Europe, I actually ended up going to school in France for a while, so that's how I ended up there.
Very cool. So yeah, I mean, just the time that I've known you, you shared some stories with me about traveling around. Let me ask you this, and I don't think I actually have ever asked you this before. Is there a special place that you've lived or have been to that holds a special place in your heart above any others?
There are a few, actually. Scandinavia, I absolutely fell in love with Scandinavia, particularly Denmark. I just love the people there, the culture. I'm just absolutely obsessed with that. Montreal, I ended up going to Montreal to cover the Montreal Jazz Festival, I think 7 years ago.
Wow.
And I just fell in love with it so much that now I go every summer and spend part of my summer in Montreal. And England, I'm a total Anglophile, and that came from growing up in the 80s and listening to bands like Duran Duran. You know me on that one. So, that's my love affair with all things British.
Well, you and I definitely share that in common, so.
Certain other places, like France, I fell in love with their food, but also their approach to food, and somebody told me once when I was living in France was in France you work to live. In America you live to work.
That's right. Yeah.
And it's actually true. We actually in this country work more hours than any other country in the world. They get weeks, 6 weeks, I believe, of vacation. And if you're in certain fields like medical fields, in the medical field you can get additional weeks of vacation. Mm-hmm. So the emphasis is really, but it's also an entirely different mindset. Which I found interesting living in France, because you think of France and you think of haute couture and fashion week, and you would think that people just have closets and closets full of clothes or whatever, but I actually found quite the opposite to be true, that most people did not own a lot of clothing or a lot of material stuff. Mm-hmm. And instead, they really put their money into traveling. Wow. And as a matter of fact, my professor from when I went to school in France. We stayed in touch, and he and his family used to come to the U.S. every summer and go to like all the national parks, and they would invite me to go along with them. And you see like, lots and lots of tourists from Europe who come to the national parks in the U.S. and almost enjoy our parks more than we do, which I think is how sad is that?
Oh yeah.
We don't even take advantage of stuff in our own country. But it's a totally different mindset. It's, I'm going to spend my money on an experience rather than on a thing.
Yeah, well, and that's a really interesting concept, because that's what you don't see a lot of people in general doing these days, and maybe a little bit more because of, what we've gone through over the past couple of years, which we'll get into. But my grandfather definitely raised me that way, is to have experiences with your money rather than having stuff. So next, I'd really like to ask you, what made you decide to jump ship from being in what some might consider a stable, ongoing need field, the legal field? What made you decide to walk away from it and essentially become an entrepreneur?
Well, a bunch of things actually, but 9/11 played a big part of it, and my experience over 9/11 actually really kind of opened my eyes to, unfortunately, how corporate America tends to treat its employees. It also, I'd originally moved to New York to go to law school, and the word advocate, from the Latin, advocare, actually means to speak for, to be a voice for, which is what I initially wanted to do, to be a voice for the voiceless. And unfortunately, with what I ended up doing was being a voice for banks, people who would, or entities rather, who might be considered the bad guys. And it was so funny. A book that I read just before all of this was American Psycho, which was later made into a really good movie by Mary Haren. And I'm like, and I kept thinking of that. And it doesn't have to be American Psycho. I know another one was that one was with Christian Bale, of course, is
right.
The villain. But another one that comes to mind is Wall Street. Remember with Michael Douglas's Gordon Gekko and his famous line, "Greed is good." And I thought about this, so what ended up happening was after 9/11 happened, and the certain mayor who shall remain nameless went downtown and told everybody, "Oh, the air's fine. Everybody go back to work. The air's totally fine." And I'm like, yeah, of course they're saying that, because they want to reopen Wall Street. They want to reopen the stock exchange. And that also really started making me think about certain policies, why are people saying certain things, what's actually the goal there, and unfortunately it's follow the money, and whose interests are they actually serving? If your interest is opening the stock exchange, it's certainly not the public's interest. I mean, most Americans actually don't even own stocks. Yeah, so I really started thinking about that and thinking about, so much of my youth that was spent, I working on cases where we'd work 80 to 100 hours a week.
Oh, my.
And, so much of my youth spent on representing these Wall Street villains who would remind anybody of Patrick Bateman or Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street. And I'm like, why am I? And also the idea of, if I'm going to work this hard, why am I going to do that to help somebody else get rich?
True.
And if I'm going to work that hard, I may as well be working for myself. Just really made me start thinking about that, and so they ordered us to go back to work 3 days after 9/11 happened.
Oh,
and
wow.
I just remember the sidewalks, because the subway stop where I normally would have gotten off to get to my office building was closed because of what happened at the World Trade Center. So I actually had to get off at the next open stop, which was about a mile away, and walk that distance to my office. And the sidewalks were covered with like an inch of ash because the buildings were still burning. burning for, a good 6 months later, and ash is, just falling out of the sky. There's an inch of ash everywhere. So it was almost like walking on glass. It was that slippery.
Wow.
And what I'll never forget is the smell, because it smelled like burning hair, just this horrible chemical smell that just hung in the air for 6 months. And so, here you have politicians telling you, oh, the air's fine. And it's kind of like, do you trust your lying eyes or whatever? Forgot how the saying goes. But I'm like, don't tell me the air is fine. I can smell this, and I know the air is not fine. But then I was amazed that other people did believe that. And, it's kind of funny. I know we'll talk about this later on, the whole coronavirus situation. Maybe the reason I had no problem wearing a mask was because I wore a mask every day for months after 9/11. And probably is one of the reasons I did not get as sick as some of my coworkers, some of my colleagues who also work down there. And, I think it's because I wore a mask every day, even when other people were laughing at me, like, oh, the air's fine. They said so on TV. And that's when you just got to trust your own gut instinct, and say, no, this is not right. I don't care what they're saying on TV. This is not right. And so the office where I worked, and, this is a firm that, again, represented major banks, and so clearly money was not an issue for them.
Right.
But they didn't spend any of it on us.
Oh.
They didn't do much to clean the, because that ash and dust and stuff went everywhere. It was in the vents and the carpets, and so the office itself smelled like this. And I noticed that my coworkers were getting sick, and I actually ended up filing a complaint. I filed a complaint with OSHA against the firm where I worked. Because these conditions are not acceptable. People are getting sick.
Right.
And it was really funny because they printed out a notice and put it in the one of the employee lounges saying, oh, we received an OSHA complaint, and the OSHA people came, and they didn't find anything. And I was really suspicious about where they took the OSHA people. I'm like, what did you show them that they didn't find anything? Because it certainly was not my part of the building. So yeah, it really struck me that, you can, like I said, give the better part of your life to a corporation, and in the end, they don't care about you. What are you going to get, the gold watch or something?
Right.
I think one of the most eye-opening experiences, actually, before 9/11 was another company that I worked at, and I was very suspicious that they were going to start downsizing, because the department that I worked in, I noticed as people quit, they weren't being replaced.
That's a good sign.
And well, that's the thing. Like, a lot of people claim they're caught off guard when companies are downsized, and I'm like, but you really shouldn't be. If you're paying attention, you can see the writing on the wall.
Yep.
You can see, and like one of the things they were, I initially was working in a team with 4 attorneys, and then before long I ended up working with 12 attorneys, because other people who were leaving were not being replaced, and so they just gave me more and more work.
Wow.
But yet they would tell me not to work a minute past, don't work a minute past 6. We don't want to pay overtime. And I'm like, why? Do you not have the money to pay overtime? And if so, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence. And so I started looking for a new job, and 2 other people left when I did. And I remember speaking to one of my coworkers at the time and saying, they're going to let everybody go. I mean, you realize that's what's going to happen. They're going to downsize this entire department. And what I find is that paralyzes people is either comfort or fear. Yeah. And those are 2 things that, because you always think, well, with fear, you get like a fight or flight reaction. And I'm like, yeah, but there's also a third option, and that's absolute paralysis, when you're like that deer caught in headlights or whatever. And the same thing happens when you're comfortable. When you're too comfortable and you get into a little routine, and that's when you can't see the signs around you. The 3 cubicles in your your floor are empty now because people weren't replaced, but you're in your little, it's almost like in this kind of stage of being automated, like where you just come in and you do your thing, you go home, and you're not aware of what's going on around you, and it's almost too scary to. You don't want to make yourself uncomfortable. This is what I've known. And I remember one woman telling me that. She's like, well, I've worked here for 20 years. And I'm like, so what, they're going to give you the gold watch? Or I'm like, you're the very first person on the chopping block because you have worked there 20 years. They got to give you more vacation time. They got to get, I'm like, you're the very first person out of here. And this company actually waited until the day before Thanksgiving to can the entire department. Like, here, happy holidays, you're fired. And I'm just like, why give your loyalty to a company? They're not going to give it to you.
This is true.
It's not a two-way street. So, those were some eye-opening experiences. And I said, you know what, let me just work for myself.
So let me ask you this, Soledad. Did you experience any adverse effects from the dust inhaling on a regular basis from 9/11?
A few, actually. And, like I said, because I was always wearing the mask, I did not fare as badly as some of my coworkers, some of whom actually got really serious health problems, including cancer. But my issues became more respiratory. I have asthma now. I have breathing issues and sinus and all that. I also have a ton of problems with my skin, and unfortunately that one is not actually on the current list of it's called VCF, Victims Compensation Fund conditions, but basically I am super sensitive to all kinds of chemicals. So I just in cleaning my house and stuff, I have to buy the more natural stuff that you would normally find at the store, like Whole Foods, or just use natural products like vinegar. And same thing with like perfumes, cosmetics. I can't. Most of the commercially available stuff out there, I can't use, and it's really frustrating because I will get just rashes everywhere, or my skin will swell up. And it's kind of interesting because this actually led to the founding of Build a Better Planet. Because one restaurant I was working at was really cool. It was a little cafe that was actually part of a bookstore called East West Books, and it's really interesting how like just in life things come full circle and things happen. Just my belief anyway that things will happen when they need to happen. As a teenager, I was very into kind of esoteric things, kind of off the wall, eclectic kind of things. And, just in the process of, going to college and then ending up working at this Wall Street law firm, it really, shut down that part of me. And I was just focused on, it eats your soul. You're focused on making money and, so anyway, when I went to work as a chef, I ended up at this little cafe that was part of this bookstore. It was called East West Books. This is kind of a cool story also. Sorry, I'm deviating into.
Oh, that's all right. Go.
Little side stories.
Sure.
They ended up opening a yoga studio and the cafe, and the place went out of business, which was really sad because it had been a mainstay in New York's Village area for like 30 years. And when it went out of business, a lot of the employees got together and reopened it as there are actually two stores now, one in the East Village, one in the West Village. I don't know if they're both owned by the same group, but they're the former employees who used to work there. And I'm like, well, that's cool. And it's really such a treasure because when I first moved to New York in 1997, there were a bunch of these little esoteric kind of bookstores, and one by one they all went out of business, or most of them, I should say. And some of them were actually directly affected by 9/11 because you couldn't, stuff was cordoned off by police, and so you couldn't physically even get to some of the stores. But this one, like I said, had been a mainstay. And anyway, so they had this little cafe, and I was having constant problems with my skin and getting these rashes. And, that was actually an issue with me working as a chef there, because it was an open kitchen, so people could actually see me preparing their food. And I'm like, oh my God, people don't want to see somebody with a horrible rash on their hands.
True.
Touching their food, even though it's an allergy. It's not contagious or anything. And of course, you're wearing gloves or you should be, if you're touching people's food. But one of my coworkers, I'd been at that time trying to get any kind of going to dermatologists and stuff, and all they'd want to give me are steroids, which just make you fat.
Right.
And they weren't doing anything. I wasn't getting any benefit. And so one of my coworkers said, have you tried borage seed oil? And I said, I don't even know what that is, so no. And so he said, you can get some at, sounds like I'm doing a plug for Whole Foods here, but he said, you can get some at Whole Foods, go check it out. And basically what I learned, it was not just borage seed oil, but any of the omega, EFA oils that have omega 369. And it actually did help with my skin problems. And, since then I've become a big believer in hemp oil, and hemp seed oil and stuff. CBD oil has been very beneficial. But that really started changing the way I looked at food, and kind of looking at food as medicine. Like, as a matter of fact, I had a book called The Green Pharmacy, I believe it was by Andrew Wild. Don't quote me on that, but yeah, it would just tell you, like, if you have this condition, these foods might help with that condition, and these foods might make it worse. And so I just started looking at that, and really became very conscious of what I was eating. And to where one of the things that we always say on the Green Living Show is read your labels.
Right.
like if I need a degree in chemistry to know what something is, and that's probably not something I want to put in my body. I don't know what a polysorbate 80 is, or I don't know what a red number 40 is.
That's true.
And really, it was interesting, like, when looking at, stuff like oatmeal, for instance. Like, when you make oatmeal, it should have like 5 ingredients. And you go to some of these chain restaurants, and they'll have an oatmeal that's got 60 ingredients in it. And I'm like, why? So the more I got into, like, really looking at food as medicine, and looking at some of the things you see across demographics in the U.S., and really realizing that food is an issue. Like, so many of our health problems in the United States are food related.
Sure.
Caused by, anything from diabetes to heart disease, obesity. These are all, it's caused by the food we're eating,
Right.
And but then it also made me very aware of parts of my own city that are food deserts, where people don't even it's crazy to think that in a big city somebody wouldn't have access to healthy food.
True.
But there's a neighborhood that has Kennedy Fried Chicken, so I'm like, oh, it's like knockoff KFC. And then there's another neighborhood that has Crown Fried Chicken. I'm like, well, they're not even knockoff KFC, they're Crown Fried Chicken. But if that's literally the only restaurant in your neighborhood and there's no grocery store, it's, it was really an eye-opener for me. I had an intern when we were still able to have in-person interns. He came from a neighborhood like that, and one day I had treated him to lunch, and we went to a Trader Joe's, and I just remember him looking at, like, the produce section and being in awe. And he said, well, we don't have this where I live. I'm like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, all this, like, these fruits and vegetables and stuff. And that's what it really hit me, like, oh my gosh, some people really don't have access to that. And really, the more I learned about food and the impact it had on me, and the more and how it can be used as a way to improve your quality of life, I really felt this kind of duty to share that with other people. And that then led to the creation of Build a Better Planet and the different shows that we do, because all the talk shows have a cooking and food component to them. Kind of insisted on that. Initially, I was working with another producer, and we've since parted ways, but yeah, I really insisted on having the food segment because I wanted to share what I'd learned.
Awesome. That really leads into what Behind the Mask is really all about and what we really focus on with people that we interview. So let me ask you this now. With the pandemic, surely it's affected everyone, but the reason why we created this show is to talk about how it affected everyone individually, personally, and professionally. So how do you feel like the pandemic has affected you professionally?
Professionally, because of the nature of what I do, I really didn't experience any kind of, other than the physical location. We used to have an office in Chelsea, and then it shut down because somebody in the building had tested positive for COVID, so they shut it down. And so then I started working from home, but, basically I'm doing the same type of work that I was doing before. It did change. We do work with a lot of students. We get a lot of student interns, and that has switched to being entirely remote internships for the time being, or at least for the foreseeable future.
Well, let me ask you a question. Now, some changes that have happened through the pandemic, some people are embracing them and want them to stay in their professions. Some people want them to go away as quickly as possible. But with what you're saying about, like, for the interns, for example, and how you're working with them remotely instead of in person, do you have a preference, or do you see the benefits to both ways of working with them?
I do see the benefits to both ways of working with them. I have noticed that over the past year, I've had several groups of interns, and there seems to have been, and I guess it's just, I guess a lot of these students have been going to school remotely, so they haven't been interacting a lot with people directly, and I do see the impact of that. And although there I'm talking about younger students, those are high school students. With the college students, it's not really a problem because they're older. But with the younger students, I definitely do see I guess it'd become a little lax, I should say, because you're not. If you were in high school and you went from a normal high school experience of going to class every day and having to change classes, and you have a certain routine, and then all of a sudden you don't, and you're doing Zoom school or whatever. And God bless these kids. I really feel badly. I hate Zoom with a passion, and I couldn't imagine doing Zoom school every day,
Right.
And so, I guess, it has posed some challenges, I'll say. Nothing insurmountable. There are, ways around everything. I think that's something very, that's part of the American spirit, I think. We're innovative.
True.
We can find ways around stuff. But I definitely have noticed a change in some of the students, just like I said, from doing remote school for a year. And I just feel so bad for the students also. I couldn't imagine, like, you were so looking forward to going to your senior prom or whatever, and then my niece graduated from college during all of this, and they had to have like this online graduation. I'm like, oh, that's just not the same. That's not the same as having an actual graduation and getting to throw your cap in the air and all that stuff.
Well, and that's so true, because there's so many things that the pandemic has really affected people with, and it's like we talked about professionally, but personally, and that's a good example because, for families that wanted to attend graduations and maybe weddings and things like that, weddings have been postponed or just whatever. So that leads me into, with you, how has the pandemic affected you on a personal level, Soledad?
Oh, goodness. I stay home a lot more.
Right.
With regards to travel, it's a lot more jumping through hoops. I was actually, so my folks live in Texas, and I was actually there earlier in the year. At that time, I was not vaccinated. And even though, you do have this airline that I flew did require that you get a negative test in order to fly, but I chose to stay in a hotel and not stay with them because I just said, I'd rather err on the side of caution. And when we did meet up, it was like the drive-by.
Yeah.
We actually met up out outside. They have a little porch in their backyard. So we're like, yeah, we'll just sit out here and have an outdoor reunion and stand 6 feet away from each other wearing a mask. Just recently, just got back from Montreal, actually, and travel is, particularly traveling abroad, is very challenging right now. I mean, there's so many steps you have to take, and it was definitely a challenge. But I mean, for me personally, it has not been. I hate to say this, but you just see people who are just losing their mind over the pandemic. And you and I have had this discussion. I think it does tend to be people who are used to a very rigid schedule, a very rigid routine, which again, goes back to the high school students. If you're in high school, you do have a very rigid routine. And I think because of that, they're not adapting very well. Whereas those of us who are freelancers and entrepreneurs, and if you run your own business, you're used to having to roll with the punches.
True. Yes.
And, that was, before I started doing what I'm doing now, I worked in the restaurant business. That's what I did after I left the legal field. I worked as a chef, and, very often, I would work one-on-one with restaurant owners, and there's just such a commitment when you open a restaurant. It's a tremendous expenses involved, and, you got to buy the equipment, buy the ingredients, employ a bunch of people. And so you really do have to learn to roll with the punches, because stuff just doesn't always work out the way you anticipate. But that ability it's almost like doing improv or something, that ability to kind of think on your feet, it helps you adapt, you know, and, like we, Build a Better Planet does do some live events, which we obviously canceled everything last year. This year we were kind of toying with, well, should we do something later this year? I think best way to approach that is not commit to anything. And that's why, again, like you brought up the weddings, I actually got kind of annoyed and frustrated with people like this who were, again, kind of losing their minds over, well, I had a wedding planned, and I'm like, yeah, but there's a pandemic, so, I mean, part of that's just life, I mean, growing up in the South, we would get a hurricane, or stuff happens, and geez, sorry you had planned your dream wedding, but stuff happens, and you better plan, make other arrangements. And, and that's just it. You kind of, your options are you could cry about it or get angry about it or just kind of roll with the punches and figure something else out. And, there were some people who had some really creative kind of solutions. I know here in New York, they showed a couple that got married out in the street, and like everybody was looking out the window, clapping for them and stuff.
Yeah.
And there was another person who got married. This was that was covered on TV, and they had like cutouts of all their guests. And then the guests were joining them on Zoom. And I'm like, well, that's cute, and then, we've been trying to think about, hey, should we, how about we tentatively plan for something later on this year? And if it's not possible to do it, we'll just reschedule for another year. No big deal.
Yeah, well, and yes, and you're right, you and I have had this discussion many times, when you hear, like you said, people boo-hooing over their dream wedding, and what I want to say is, but you and your spouse-to-be are still alive, and you love each other, so, granted, with everything going on, why don't we look at the positives here? You guys still have each other.
Absolutely.
There's been so many people that have lost loved ones. And I know that just in speaking with you all this time, that you yourself have lost quite a few people.
I lost 2 uncles to the pandemic and 11 friends.
Wow.
And that's not even including the friends that I had who did get it and recovered, so, unfortunately, I have had a tremendous sense of anger and frustration when I'm still encountering people who don't believe the pandemic is real or think it's some kind of conspiracy or whatever. Or I'm like, where have you been for the last what are we on? We're almost 2 full years of this now. Where have you been?
Right.
And please don't come to me and tell me that you don't think this is real when I know people personally who've died from it, or I had an experience. I had gone to Texas, as I mentioned earlier this year, and I think part of what's also happened is people have forgotten how to behave in public.
They have.
Yeah. I'm like, wow, what's going on?
Yep.
So I was in a cafe, and I'm minding my own business. I'm not talking to this lady. And this was a grandmother who was there with her grandchildren, which I found particularly disturbing because I'm like, wow, lady, great example you're setting there. And she had a problem with me wearing a mask. And I'm like, what business is it to you if I'm wearing a mask or not?
Right.
How does this affect you in any way? And she's on the other side of the restaurant. Like, I'm quite a distance from her. But for some reason, this was really bugging her, and she felt the need to say something. And again, I'm like, you're here with your grandchildren. This is the example you're setting for your grandkids? Really?
Right.
And, and then her comment to me was, again, she was also, claiming that COVID wasn't real, it's not really dangerous, blah, blah, blah. And so, I pointed out to her, I said, I am high risk actually because of the health conditions I developed after 9/11. I am in a higher risk category, and I said, well, that's why I'm wearing this. And then she says something, well, what about cancer or heart disease? And I'm like, lady, nobody's going to sneeze on you and give you cancer. That's not how cancer works. It's like it's really left me, sometimes speechless. Like, how do you even argue with that? Like
you
for
can't.
real? I just left, and I'm like, go with God, lady. I don't even know what to tell you.
Well, I've heard some people say that the pandemic has brought out the best in people. Some people have said it's brought out the worst in people. My theory is that
Both.
It's just brought out who people really are.
Well, that's kind of, I always said that about alcohol and drugs, too. Because as a society, we tend to use alcohol and drugs as scapegoats for things like, this person drinks too much. And I'm like, I don't think either one of those things make you, behave in a certain way. Like you said, I think it just brings out who you naturally are, which is why you might get the happy drunk who thinks they can sing karaoke all of a sudden, or the emotional drunk who's like, I love you, man. or the angry drunk who's all of a sudden trying to start a fist fight. We don't take on anybody in this bar. Like, cut them off. But I think it just brings out your natural personality. If you're kind of a jerk, you're just going to be more of a jerk.
But wait, Soledad, don't forget about the people that get drunk to get the cojones to get on stage and sing, and when they get up there, they sound like an angel.
Or they think they do. Actually, that person was usually me.
Well, I just want to tell you that it's been such a pleasure and a joy to have you on the show, and I don't think that we could honestly encapsulate our conversations together into one program. We could actually do this as a series, but for Behind the Mask, I think we really kind of hit a lot of really cool subjects and topics with you regarding this whole pandemic and how it's affected you. I guess the last thing I'd like to do is give you the opportunity to talk about how people can follow you if they want to keep up with you, maybe if you have a blog or any of the shows you mentioned and such.
Well, I have a Facebook page, Soledad Haren on Facebook. And other than that, it's our website, thirdstrikeradio.com, and that's 3, the number 3, thirdstrikeradio.com, and that's where you can hear all of the shows that I produce that are actually made possible by the many wonderful hosts and DJs like DJ Tamra.
Well, we wouldn't be able to do it without you. I mean, I remember hesitating to bring the idea of Behind the Mask to you because I know that I've come up with several ideas over the years, and most of them we haven't gone with because it's maybe like a 3 o'clock in the morning I wake up, hey, that sounds like a great idea. No, it's not. And so, but this one, I was so glad that you embraced the idea, and I think this interview with you has definitely been one of my faves so far, although they've all been amazing. But yeah, like I said, I think, we could definitely do this many times, and maybe I'll have you back soon. But again, I'm grateful that we were able to make the time together. And to the listeners, don't forget to keep up with us. Just type in on Facebook Behind the Mask, and you can go ahead and click like on that and follow us for upcoming interviews with all kinds of cool people, much like Soledad. And thank you so much for tuning in to the interview today. And stay tuned definitely for more to come. Thank you again, Soledad.